3 days after signing the biggest deal of my life, a stranger called me. I bought an old hard drive. It still connects to a camera system. Then he paused. It's inside your house. My grip tightened. I didn't mean to see it, he said quietly. But I saw your wife in your office, opening your safe. Silence. And that's not all. Don't confront her. Come alone. I didn't answer, because in that moment, I realized whatever was happening in my home had started long before I ever walked into it. I don't take it for granted that you're here, thank you sincerely. Now tell me something. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. I read every single one. Quick heads up. This story includes fictional elements for storytelling and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual names or locations is coincidental, but the message behind it, that part is worth your attention. The last signature of the day always felt different from the rest. It wasn't the ink or the paper or even the dollar amount printed in clean block numbers across the top of the contract. It was the silence that came after that brief, particular stillness when the pen lifts and the deal becomes real. I set the pen down on my desk, leaned back in my chair, and let that silence settle over me like the October light coming through the tall windows of my home office. $47 million. A federal procurement contract with the Department of Defense, 3 years in the making, now folded neatly inside a Caldwell Dynamics folder on my desk. Outside, the grounds of 404 Governor's Club Drive stretched wide, an unhurried, manicured lawn, old oaks losing their leaves in slow copper spirals, the kind of yard that said you earned this without a word. I was 58 years old. I had been building Caldwell Dynamics for 25 years, starting from a converted storage room in Durham with nothing but 2 engineers, 1 investor, and a man named Archibald Winthrop, who believed in the company before there was much to believe in. We had survived recessions, failed product lines, and the brutal years when payroll came before my own salary. And now I sat in a house in Chapel Hill that I still couldn't quite believe was mine, watching the afternoon light move across the floor. I pulled open the top drawer of my desk, without thinking, a small habit I'd developed over the past few weeks. Inside, nestled in a slim velvet box, was a diamond ring. Nothing extravagant. Clean lines, platinum band, a single stone that caught the light in a way that felt honest rather than showy. I'd picked it out 2 months ago for our 3rd anniversary. Vanessa didn't know it existed. I planned to give it to her that weekend over dinner, maybe down by the garden where she liked to sit when the evenings cooled. I closed the drawer and looked out toward the yard. Vanessa had come into my life 3 years ago, when I was 55, and had quietly accepted that certain chapters were behind me. My first marriage had ended when I was 45. No great tragedy, just 2 people who had grown into different shapes and finally admitted it. For 10 years after that, I had poured everything into the company. I told myself it was enough. And then Vanessa appeared, a former university connection, who had come recommended as a restructuring consultant, and something in me that I thought had gone quiet started moving again. A year later, she was COO. A year after that, she was my wife. I used to think, the best decision I had ever made. I heard her in the kitchen before I saw her, the soft percussion of cabinet doors, the hiss of the espresso machine, small domestic sounds that had become the background music of my evenings. A few minutes later, she came through the doorway of the office, a ceramic mug in each hand, barefoot on the hardwood, wearing a light sweater the color of cream. "Afternoon coffee for you, sweetheart," she said, setting the mug on the corner of my desk. She glanced at the folder. Big day. Big enough, I said. She smiled, squeezed my shoulder once, and drifted back toward the hallway. I lifted the mug, breathed in the steam, and took a slow sip. Warm, smooth. Exactly the way I liked it. I remember thinking in that exact moment that this was what a good life felt like, not loud, not dramatic, just steady and full and quietly extraordinary. It was ordinary enough to break your heart looking back. My phone buzzed against the desk. Unknown number. Burlington, North Carolina area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. I had no meetings scheduled for the afternoon, but something made me pick up. Mr. Caldwell. The voice was careful, measured. A man who had rehearsed what he was going to say. My name is Darnell Booker. I run a computer repair shop over in Burlington Triangle Tech Repair on Chapel Hill Road. I'm sorry to bother you, sir. I want to be up front. I'm not sure what the right thing to do here is, but I figured calling you was better than not calling. I sat forward. Mr. Booker, go ahead. He explained slowly and in order. He had purchased a lot of surplus electronics, old drives cables, some outdated networking equipment from a business liquidation sale the week before. Standard inventory for his shop. One of the hard drives, a standard 2.5-inch unit, had the words Caldwell Dynamics laser etched across the back panel. He had almost wiped it immediately, but out of habit, he always checked drives before formatting. He plugged it in first. A piece of software launched on its own. No desktop icon, no installation prompt. Just an interface that opened directly to a live video feed. I'm looking at what appears to be an interior room, Mr. Caldwell, Darnell said quietly. A living room, I think. There's nobody in the frame right now, but the feed is active. It's running right now as we speak. The October light was still moving across my floor. Through the window, I could see Vanessa in the garden holding a small copper watering can, tilting it gently over the flower bed along the south wall. She was humming something I couldn't hear. She looked perfectly relaxed. Mr. Booker, I said, keeping my voice level. Don't touch the drive. Don't close the software. I'll be in Burlington tomorrow morning. I set the phone down and did not move for a long moment. Then I stood put on my jacket and walked to the doorway of the kitchen. Vanessa looked up when I appeared. I crossed the room, leaned down, and kissed her on the cheek, the way I had done 100 times before. Something came up at the office, I said. I'll be back before dinner. She nodded, touched my arm, and smiled that easy smile. I walked to the car without looking back. But in the rearview mirror, as I pulled down the drive, I saw her standing on the front steps, waving once, then turning back toward the garden. I kept my eyes on the road ahead. Burlington was 40 minutes north, and for the first time in a very long time, I had no idea what I was driving toward. Triangle Tech Repair was smaller than I expected. I had pictured something more substantial, a proper storefront, maybe a bright logo above the door. What I found instead was a narrow unit wedged between a dry cleaner and a Vietnamese sandwich shop on Chapel Hill Road. Its window half covered by a sun-faded decal advertising screen replacements and data recovery. A bell above the door announced me when I pushed it open. The smell hit first, that particular mix of solder-aged plastic and recycled air that clings to every repair shop I have ever walked into. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead in long white strips. Shelves along both walls held gutted laptops labeled components in clear bags and stacks of drives arranged with the quiet logic of a man who knew exactly where everything was. Darnell Booker was already standing when I came through the door. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, dark complexion, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He wore a gray work shirt with the shop's name stitched above the breast pocket, and his hands, I noticed immediately, were not entirely still. Not shaking, just the particular restlessness of someone who has been sitting with uncomfortable information and is relieved to finally hand it to the person it belongs to. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "thank you for coming in person." "Thank you for calling," I said. I meant it. He led me to a workbench at the back of the shop, where a laptop sat open beside the hard drive in question, a standard unit black casing. The words, "Caldwell Dynamics," etched cleanly across the rear panel, in the fine lines of a laser engraver. I recognized the marking immediately. In the early years of the company, Archibald and I had established a simple rule. Every piece of hardware that left our offices, drives, routers, peripherals, got the company name engraved on it. It was a loss prevention habit, nothing more. We had not thought much about it since. Today, that small rule had led a stranger in Burlington straight to my front door. Darnell pulled a stool toward the bench and gestured for me to sit. Then he began to explain, slowly and in plain language, as if he had already anticipated that I would need it broken down. The hard drive, he told me, had not simply been used for storage. It had been configured as a dedicated backup device for a networked IP camera system, the kind of setup used in professional offices, where footage is written continuously to a local drive, rather than streamed to the cloud. The drive was formatted to work with a specific camera management application, a piece of software that, when launched, automatically logged into a registered account and displayed every camera connected to that account. When I plugged it into my machine to check it, Darnell said, the software opened on its own. It found an active internet connection here in the shop, logged into the account, and pulled up everything currently online under that account. He paused. That's how I saw the live feed. I wasn't hacking anything. The program just did what it was built to do. "How many cameras are registered to the account?" I asked. "2," he said. One was installed at a commercial address in Durham, one city center based on the location tag embedded in the device settings. He looked at me carefully. The other one has a residential tag, a Chapel Hill address. I held his gaze and said nothing. He turned the laptop toward me. "This is footage from the Durham camera, recorded 6 days ago." The timestamp in the corner read early evening. The angle was low shot from somewhere near an electrical outlet along the baseboard of what I recognized as the executive floor at One City Center, our old office before the move. The frame was partially obstructed by a desk leg, but the figure in the shot was clear enough. Vanessa. She was alone in the office. She crossed to the credenza along the far wall, crouched in front of it, and opened the small combination safe built into the lower cabinet, a safe I used for hard copies of NDAs and preliminary patent filings. She worked the dial without hesitation, as though she had opened it many times before. Then she removed a folder, laid it flat on the desk, and began photographing each page with her phone. Methodical, unhurried. Her face carried the focused calm of someone completing a routine task. I watched the full clip without speaking. It lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. When it ended, I asked him to check whether both feeds were currently active. Darnell typed for a moment. His expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. The kind of shift that happens when something confirms what you were already afraid of. There's a second live feed, he said quietly. It's running right now. He turned the screen toward me again. The image was sharper than the first, higher resolution, better placement. A bedroom. A lamp on the nightstand cast a warm cone of light across the near side of a king-sized bed. The angle came from somewhere inside the lamp itself. I realized a lens positioned behind the shade invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. Vanessa was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back partially to the camera, a phone pressed to her ear. Her lips were moving. Whatever she was saying, the camera carried no audio. She was still dressed, though it was past 10 in the evening. Her posture was straight, deliberate, not the posture of someone making a casual call. I recognized the bedspread, the nightstand, the window behind her. That was my bedroom. I stared at the screen for a long moment. The woman on it had slept beside me for 3 years, had handed me coffee that same afternoon, had waved from the front steps as I pulled out of the driveway. I had kissed her on the cheek not 18 hours ago. I did not recognize her at all. Can you determine who installed these cameras? I said, and when? Darnell nodded slowly. I can try to pull the device registration data and installation timestamps from the software logs. He hesitated, then looked at me directly. But Mr. Caldwell, there's more on this drive. A lot more. The backup goes back further than the footage I showed you. He paused. Do you want to see all of it? I looked at the screen one more time. Vanessa was still on the phone, still talking to someone I couldn't see. Yes, I said. Show me everything. Darnell opened the root folder without a word. The file list populated slowly, line by line, the way old systems do when they are pulling from a drive that has stored more than it was ever meant to. Dozens of video files, each labeled with an automatic timestamp. I scanned down the column of dates from the bottom up, recent footage at the top, older entries descending in neat rows toward the beginning of the archive. The oldest file sat at the bottom of the list. The timestamp read 4 years and 1 month ago. I did the math without meaning to. That was 3 months before Vanessa and I were married. Darnell glanced at me, then back at the screen. You want to start there? Yes, I said. He double-clicked the file. The footage was shot from the same angle as the clips we had already reviewed, low near the baseboard, partially obscured by furniture. But the office in this recording looked different. Lighter, the way a space looks before it has been lived in. The desks were bare. The shelving along the east wall was empty. This was one city center before Caldwell Dynamics had moved in, before I had signed the lease, before a single box of equipment had crossed that threshold, which meant the camera had been there first. Darnell must have understood what I was thinking, because he spoke before I could. The device registration log shows the camera was activated 14 months before your company's lease start date, he said carefully. Whoever installed it had access to the space before your tenancy began. I had leased that office through a firm called Meridian Property Partners, a mid-sized commercial real estate brokerage out of Charlotte. They had offered competitive rates, handled the paperwork efficiently, and I had thought nothing of it. I had thought nothing of it for 6 years. 2 figures appeared on screen. The first I did not recognize immediately, a tall man, mid-60s, silver-haired, moving through the empty office with the ease of someone who owned the room even when he didn't. He wore a dark suit and carried no briefcase, no folder, nothing. He did not need props. The second figure was younger, slimmer, dark hair, attentive posture. It took me 4 seconds to recognize her. The man spoke first. His voice came through the laptop's small speakers with a slight compression, but the words were clear. Raymond Caldwell is exceptionally intelligent, he said, moving to the window and looking out at the Durham skyline as if he were surveying something that already belonged to him. But he has been alone since his divorce. Men like that, men who have built everything themselves and have no one left to share it with, they do not become careless. They become trusting, completely unconditionally trusting. That is not a weakness we exploit. He paused. That is a door we walk through. Vanessa stood near the center of the room. She was listening with the focused stillness of someone receiving a mission briefing. "How long will this take?" she asked. The man turned from the window. "As long as it needs to. Make contact. Build the relationship. Marry him if necessary." He said it the way someone might say, file the report or book the flight. Clean, functional. We need the core algorithm. Project Meridian cannot move forward without it. $340 million does not wait, Vanessa. I later learned the man's name, Harlan Greer, 66 years old. Chief executive of Greer Capital Group, headquartered at One Wells Fargo Center in Charlotte. He was, as I would come to understand, the architect of everything that followed. The next file in the sequence showed Vanessa seated at a small table with a printed briefing document in front of her photographs, schedules a professional profile. My professional profile. She was being walked through my habits, my schedule, my preferences. The industry conference I attended every October, a technology networking event in Raleigh Tech Connect, held annually at the Convention Center on South Salisbury Street. I remembered that conference. I remembered the seat beside me being empty when I arrived. And then during the afternoon session, a woman sitting down with an apologetic smile and a cup of coffee she nearly spilled on my sleeve. We had talked for 40 minutes about machine learning applications in federal procurement. She had been sharp and genuinely curious. I had thought it was the best conversation I'd had at a conference in years. I had thought it was chance. Darnell stood quietly and walked to a small counter at the side of the shop. I heard the sound of a coffee maker running. A few minutes later, he set 2 mugs on the workbench without comment, one in front of his own stool, one beside my arm. I looked at the mug for a long moment. Then I moved it a few inches to the side. Away from me, Darnell said nothing. He simply nodded once, the way a man does when he understands something without needing it explained, and wrapped both hands around his own cup. On screen, the briefing file had advanced to the last frame, a close-up of a handwritten note in the margin of my profile. 4 words. Make him trust you. I placed my hand flat on the workbench. In my mind, I saw the slim velvet box in the top drawer of my desk at home. The ring I had chosen 2 months ago for a woman I had believed in absolutely. A woman who had apparently been briefed on how to make me do exactly that. The laptop screen cast a pale light across the bench. I was 58 years old, and I was learning to look at every memory of the last 3 years from a completely different angle. Copy everything, I said. Every single file. Don't delete anything. And don't tell anyone that you called me. Darnell nodded without hesitation. I picked up my jacket from the back of the stool and walked to the front of the shop. When I pushed through the door onto Chapel Hill Road, the sky over Burlington had gone from black to the deep gray that comes just before first light. I had not slept. I did not feel tired. I felt something else entirely, something cold and quiet and very, very focused. I got home at 20 minutes to 3 in the morning. The house was quiet in the way that large houses get quiet late at night. Not silent, but settled, breathing slowly through its own walls. I let myself in through the side entrance off the garage, hung my keys on the hook by the door, and stood still for a moment in the dark hallway. Down the corridor, the bedroom door was ajar. I pushed it open an inch and looked inside. Vanessa was asleep on her side, facing away from me, her breathing even and undisturbed. The room was exactly as it always was. The bedside lamp she kept on a timer had already switched off. The window curtains held still. I watched her sleep for perhaps 10 seconds. Then I pulled the door closed and walked to the kitchen. The coffee mug was still on the counter, exactly where she had left it after handing me mine yesterday afternoon. Ceramic, pale blue, a small chip on the handle she had always meant to replace. I had watched her pour from the same carafe dozens of times. Hundreds, maybe. She knew how I took it. She had known from the very first week. I picked up the mug. I poured the remaining coffee slowly down the sink. Then I rinsed the mug under cold water, dried it with the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, and set it back in its exact position on the counter. No sound. No drama. Just a small, deliberate act that felt like drawing a line between two versions of my life. The one that ended yesterday afternoon and whatever came next. I did not sleep. I sat in the office until 5, then showered and drove to Chapel Hill as the sun came up over the tree line on Governor's Club Drive. Sullivan Whitmore had been my personal physician for 10 years. He was a lean, precise man in his early 50s who ran his practice out of UNC Medical Center on Manning Drive with the quiet efficiency of someone who believed that medicine properly practiced should feel like a conversation rather than a transaction. I had always trusted him. I trusted him now because he was the one person in my medical life that I had found myself, without any recommendation from Vanessa, without any connection to anything she had touched. I told him I had reason to believe I had been exposed to a substance affecting memory and cognition. I did not tell him more than that. Not yet. He did not ask for more. He ordered the panel. While I waited, I sat in the examination room and thought about the past 3 months. The forgotten names, the transposed figures in a quarterly report that my assistant had quietly corrected before the board saw them. The morning I had stood in my own kitchen unable to recall whether I had already taken my blood pressure medication, a lapse I had attributed to stress and the chaos of the Office movie. I had mentioned it once to a physician I'd seen at UNC the previous spring, a Dr. Hargrove in the neurology department. He had reviewed my chart and told me there was nothing of concern for a man my age. I understood now why he might have said that. Whitmore came back into the room 40 minutes later, with a printed report in his hand and a look on his face that physicians develop when they are working to remain professionally neutral about something that is not neutral at all. "Sir Raymond," he said, setting the report on the examination table beside me. "Your toxicology screen came back positive for scopolamine." He explained it carefully, the way he always did. Scopolamine, known clinically as hyoscine, is a compound with legitimate medical uses, low-dose patches, for motion sickness, pre-surgical sedation. At therapeutic levels, the effects are manageable. But administered repeatedly in subtherapeutic doses over an extended period, it accumulates. It impairs short-term memory formation. It reduces the precision of judgment, not dramatically enough to raise flags, not obviously enough to alarm the person experiencing it. Enough to make a man occasionally misremember. Enough to make him sign things he might scrutinize more carefully with a clear head. So how long? I asked. Based on the accumulation levels, I'd estimate consistent low-dose exposure over the past 2 to 3 months, he said. Possibly longer. Then he paused, and his expression shifted to something more careful. There's something else, he said. He turned to his computer and pulled up my medical record on the screen. When I went to compare today's results against your baseline from 18 months ago, I noticed the notes from Dr. Hargrove's examination had been altered. The original entries have been overwritten. He turned the screen toward me. Someone accessed your file and changed the clinical observations. The system should have flagged that. It didn't. He told me the rest of it steadily without editorializing. The Greer Foundation, a philanthropic arm of a Charlotte-based investment group, had made a substantial equipment donation to the UNC Neurology Department the previous year. In exchange, they had negotiated a data integration partnership. Greer Foundation technicians were granted limited access to the hospital's electronic health record system to assist with, as the agreement described it, technical calibration. Limited access, carefully worded, apparently not limited enough. Whitmore printed 2 copies of my toxicology results, signed both, and pressed the department seal into the paper. "Keep one somewhere safe," he said, sliding both copies into a plain envelope and handing it to me. "Not at home." I took the envelope and looked at the top line of the report. Positive scopolamine hyoscine. Accumulated serum concentration consistent with repeated subtherapeutic exposure. I thought about every morning for the past 3 months. The kitchen, the sound of the espresso machine, Vanessa in the doorway with a mug in each hand, her voice soft and familiar as daylight. "Good morning, sweetheart." Words I had heard so many times they had become part of the architecture of the house. Words that now landed somewhere entirely different. I folded the envelope, put it inside my jacket, and stood. In the hallway outside, I found my phone and scrolled to a contact I had not called in several months. Nathaniel Voss. Attorney at law, Voss and Associates, 301 Fayetteville Street, Raleigh. A man I had worked with on corporate matters for 12 years and trusted with things I trusted to almost no one. He picked up on the second ring. "Nathaniel," I said. "I need an appointment. Today. Non-negotiable." It was 7:15 in the morning. By now, back at Governor's Club Drive, Vanessa would be awake. She would be in the kitchen. She would be reaching for the carafe. I got home before 8. Vanessa's car was still in the garage, which meant she was working from the house, a habit she kept on mornings when she didn't have back-to-back calls. I could hear her voice from somewhere downstairs, low, and measured the particular tone she used on professional calls. I went in through the side door, moved quietly through the kitchen, and took the stairs without stopping. In my home office, I closed the door, sat down at my desk, and opened the laptop. Darnell had sent the link at 4:47 in the morning, a compressed folder transferred through an encrypted file-sharing service, password protected. The kind of transfer a man who spent his career handling other people's data would know how to do properly. I had given him my secure email before I left the shop. He had not wasted any time. I entered the password and let the folder decompress. 43 files. I had already seen a portion of them at the shop. I began working through the remainder methodically, the way I had always reviewed financial filings without skipping ahead, without assuming I knew what was coming. I was on the 19th file when I stopped. The footage was from a camera positioned in the upper corridor of one city center. A wide-angle lens mounted near the elevator bank on the executive floor, angled downward toward the building's main entrance below. The timestamp placed it 6 months ago mid-morning on a Wednesday in April. Elliot Marsh came through the lobby doors at 10:14. He was not alone. He walked alongside a silver-haired man in a dark overcoat whom I recognized now from the footage I had watched in Burlington the night before. They crossed the lobby together with the ease of two people who had made this walk more than once. At the entrance to the parking structure, they stopped. The silver-haired man said something. Elliot nodded. They shook hands, a firm, deliberate handshake, the kind that closes something rather than opens it. Harlan Greer's car was a black sedan parked directly in front of the exit barrier. Elliot watched it pull away before turning and walking back inside. I sat back in my chair. Elliot Marsh, 34 years old. He had been with Caldwell Dynamics for 8 years, hired straight out of a graduate program at UNC Chapel Hill when he was 26. I had interviewed him myself, a 40-minute conversation that was supposed to be 30, because he had pushed back on one of my assumptions about enterprise data architecture in a way that was direct without being arrogant. I had hired him on the spot. In the years since, he had become the person I trusted to know things before I needed to know them. He had my schedule, my contacts, my travel itinerary. He sat in on the meetings that shaped the company's direction. He had been in the room for nearly everything. I closed the laptop and sat still for a moment, running back through the last 6 months. Every document Elliot had processed, every call he had been on, every briefing where he had been the one taking notes. The shapes rearranged themselves slowly the way they do when you look at something familiar through an entirely different lens. I did not reach for my phone. I did not send him a message or pick up the line that connected directly to his desk. Whatever Elliot Marsh was, whatever that handshake meant, I was not going to find out by asking him directly. Not yet. Not until I knew more. Instead, I opened a new note on my laptop and began writing down everything I intended to tell Nathaniel Voss. I had gotten through 2 pages when my phone buzzed on the desk. A text. Elliot, Raymond. We need to talk. Not at the office. Somewhere private. This is urgent. Please. I read it once. I read it again. Then I set the phone face down on the desk and kept writing. 3 minutes later, a knock at the office door. Raymond. Vanessa's voice soft and familiar through the wood. Breakfast is ready. I made coffee. I closed the laptop. I took one breath, the slow kind, the kind I had learned to take in boardrooms when I needed to appear unhurried. Then I opened the door. She was standing in the hallway with a mug in each hand, wearing a light robe, her hair loose, her expression easy and warm. Exactly as she had looked on 100 other mornings, I took the mug she offered me with both hands the way I always had. Perfect timing, I said. I smiled. She smiled back and turned toward the stairs. I watched her go, then stepped back into the office and crossed to the window. The planter on the sill, a broad ceramic pot, with a small indoor olive tree that Vanessa had placed there in the spring, sat at the level of my hip. I tilted the mug slowly and let the coffee pour into the soil, watching it disappear into the dark earth without a sound. Then I sat down, set the empty mug on the desk in front of me, and looked at it. 58 years old, 3 years of marriage built on a briefing document, 8 years of trust that might have been handed to the other side, and a toxicology report folded inside my jacket that confirmed what I had not wanted to believe. But for the first time since Darnell Booker's call had come in 2 days ago, I was not reacting. I was not afraid. I could see the shape of what needed to happen, and I could see it clearly. My phone buzzed again on the desk. I turned it over. Elliot, calling this time, not texting. I watched the screen until it stopped. Then I placed the phone face down again, picked up my pen, and went back to the notes for Nathaniel. It was not the right time. The Fearington house looked like a postcard. White stone fencing along the road. Autumn flower beds in amber and rust. A gravel path leading up to the inn's main entrance through old oaks that had been standing longer than either of us had been in business. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated it. That afternoon, I saw none of it. I walked straight through the front entrance, past the host stand, and toward the corner table in the far dining room where Archibald Winthrop was already seated. He had not touched his wine. His hands were flat on the tablecloth, his posture very straight, his eyes on me from the moment I came through the door. Archibald was 62 years old, 2 years my junior, though he had always carried himself like the older of the two of us. Silver-haired, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who filled a room without trying. We had founded Caldwell Dynamics together 25 years ago, shaken hands on it in a rented garage off Pettigrew Street in Durham with 2 engineers, 1 working prototype, and a combined savings account that would not have lasted 4 months if our first contract had fallen through. I sat down across from him and did not open the menu. "How long have you known?" I said. He did not look away. He did not reach for the wine. "2 years," he said. "Give or take." The waiter appeared at the edge of the table. I held up one hand without looking at him, and he withdrew. Archibald told it to me plainly, the way a man speaks when he has rehearsed an apology so many times it has worn smooth. 2 years ago, he had begun noticing things about Vanessa that did not sit right, small inconsistencies, questions she deflected too smoothly, an unusual familiarity with operational data that fell outside her direct responsibilities as COO. He had not said anything to me. Instead, he had quietly hired an investigator, Roland Stanton, 46 years old, licensed private investigator out of Raleigh with 15 years of experience in corporate intelligence. Archibald had used him twice before on due diligence matters and trusted his discretion. Roland had worked the case for 11 weeks before he found the thread that connected Vanessa to Greer Capital Group and from Greer Capital to Harlan Greer directly. "And then," I said. Archibald looked at his wine glass rather than at me, and then someone came to see me. He described it without embellishment. A man he did not recognize had appeared at his home in Cary on a Tuesday evening uninvited. The man had known details about the investigation that only Roland could have known, which told Archibald that somewhere there was a leak he hadn't accounted for. The man had shown him photographs his daughter Renata leaving the Greer Capital offices in Charlotte, getting into her car, crossing a parking garage. Photographs taken at a distance, at multiple locations across multiple days. "He didn't make any explicit threats," Archibald said quietly. "He didn't have to. He just said that my daughter had built a very promising career, and that it would be a shame if certain things came to light that complicated that." He paused. Renata had taken the position at Greer Capital 8 months earlier. She didn't know what I knew. She still doesn't. He had called Roland the next morning and ended the contract. He had told him the investigation was no longer needed. He had not explained why. "I chose my daughter over you, Raymond." His voice was even, but the weight behind it was not. "I'll carry that for whatever time I have left." I sat with that for a moment. Outside, through the dining room window, the Fearington grounds lay still and golden in the midday light. I thought about the garage on Pettigrew Street. I thought about the first time Archibald had talked me out of a decision that would have bankrupted us in year 3. I thought about 25 years of doing something difficult together and what it cost when the foundation of a thing cracked. "Where is Roland Stanton now?" I asked. Archibald looked up. "Still working. On his own time, his own resources. He never fully walked away from it." He reached into his jacket and removed a card, plain white, a name and phone number handwritten on the back. He told me once that Greer Capital had done this before, that it wasn't personal, just pattern. That bothered him enough that he couldn't leave it alone. I took the card. "What happened to the files he compiled?" I asked. "He kept everything," Archibald said. "All of it. He said he was waiting for the right person to hand it to." I stood. The chair moved back quietly on the stone floor. Archibald looked up at me with the expression of a man who has been waiting 2 years for the door to open and is not certain even now whether what comes through it will be mercy or consequence. "Raymond." His voice was careful. "What are you going to do?" I paused at the edge of the table. I did not turn around. "What should have been done 2 years ago," I said. I walked out through the front entrance, back down the gravel path, and into the pale October light on the Pittsboro Road. The card was in my hand. I dialed before I reached my car. It rang twice. "Stanton." A flat, practiced voice. The voice of a man who answers his phone the same way whether it is a client or a wrong number. "My name is Raymond Caldwell," I said. "I think you've been waiting for this call." A brief pause. Then, "Mr. Caldwell, I've been waiting about 22 months. Another pause. "Where would you like to meet?" Room 412 at the Hampton Inn on Durham's South Side was not what I expected. I had pictured a temporary space, a suitcase, a laptop, the anonymous tidiness of a man passing through. What I found instead was a room that had been lived in with purpose. The desk had been extended with a folding table pushed alongside it, supporting 3 external monitors arranged in a shallow arc. Printed documents covered the wall above the headboard in overlapping rows. Org charts, financial filings, satellite images of office buildings, and at the center of it all, a Greer Capital Group letterhead with a red circle drawn around the logo in marker. The circle had been drawn and redrawn until the line was thick. Roland Stanton was standing when I knocked. He was a compact man in his mid-40s, close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, wearing a plain, dark shirt with the sleeves pushed up. He had the stillness of someone who had spent a long time watching rather than moving. He shook my hand once firmly and gestured to the chair beside the desk. "I've been here 11 weeks, he said, sitting back down in front of his monitors. "This particular visit. Before that, I was in Charlotte for 4 months." "Archibald told me about your brother," I said. He nodded once without expression. "Carson. He built a data analytics firm in Austin over 9 years. Small operation, 14 employees, strong client base in the energy sector. Greer Capital approached him 18 months ago about a licensing partnership." He paused. 6 months later, Carson filed for Chapter 7. The core of his proprietary system had been quietly replicated in a product Greer Capital brought to market 3 weeks before Carson's firm lost its 2 largest contracts. He looked at me steadily. I couldn't prove it then. I've been building the case since. He turned to his monitors and opened the file he had prepared. What Roland laid out in the next 40 minutes was methodical and cold. Vanessa, using her access privileges as COO of Caldwell Dynamics, had begun extracting segments of the Project Meridian source code approximately 8 months earlier. She had not taken large files. She had divided the codebase into fragments some as small as 40 lines and transferred them individually to an external account at intervals spaced to avoid triggering the company's data loss prevention software. Over 8 months, those fragments had been reassembled on a private server registered through a holding company in the Cayman Islands. 30% of the core algorithm, Roland said. Enough to file a credible patent claim. And the rest? I asked. Safe, he said. When you moved the company's infrastructure from one city center to Governor's Club, you migrated the storage architecture to a new system. The access credentials Vanessa had been using became invalid. She lost the connection before she could complete the extraction. He looked at me. You didn't know you were protecting it, but you were. Then he pulled up a second screen, a document from the United States Patent and Trademark Office, a notice of allowance issued to a shell entity called Meridian Intellectual Holdings, LLC, for a patent claim covering a machine learning optimization framework that I recognized immediately as a derivation of our own core algorithm. When the USPTO issues a notice of allowance, Roland said, the applicant has a limited window to pay the issue fee before the patent is formally granted. Meridian Intellectual Holdings submitted that fee payment 3 days ago. Standard processing time from that point is 72 hours. He glanced at the clock on the wall, which now means approximately 69. I sat with that number for a moment. We drove to Raleigh in separate cars. Nathaniel Voss had been my attorney for 12 years, a lean, deliberate man of 54, who ran Voss and Associates out of a converted brownstone on Fayetteville Street with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be taken seriously. When I had called him from UNC Medical Center 2 mornings ago, he had cleared his afternoon without asking for a full explanation. When Roland and I arrived at his office after 9 in the evening, he was still at his desk, a yellow legal pad in front of him, a cup of tea going cold at his elbow. He listened to everything. He did not interrupt once. When Roland finished, Nathaniel set down his pen and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, the particular silence of a man organizing information rather than processing emotion. They want your technology, Raymond, he said finally. So let's give them something else entirely. He pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk and set a thick folder on the surface between us. It was labeled in his precise handwriting, but I could not read it from where I sat. I've been working corporate fraud cases for 20 years, he said. The mechanism Harlan Greer is using, a fabricated debt structure paired with a fraudulent IP, claim it has a very specific legal anatomy. And that anatomy has a pressure point. He opened the folder to a tabbed section near the middle. The trap they intend to walk Raymond into already exists in the architecture of their own filing. We don't need to build anything from scratch. We need to make sure they sign their name to it. He looked at Roland. Can you document the Cayman server connection to the notice of allowance filing? Already done, Roland said. Nathaniel nodded and looked at me. Then we have 69 hours to put this in the right position. I reached for my phone and stepped to the window. The Raleigh street below was empty, lit in orange by the sodium lamps along Fayetteville Street. Vanessa answered on the second ring. Hey, sweetheart. I kept my voice easy the way you do when something important depends on it. Meeting is running long. Don't wait up. You work too hard, she said, warm and unhurried. I already set up your coffee for the morning. Thermal carafe on your desk. Should stay hot until 7. That's perfect, I said. Thank you. I ended the call and stood at the window for a moment looking at the street below. Then I turned back to Nathaniel. How fast can you have it ready? The thermal carafe was sitting on my desk, exactly where Vanessa said it would be. I stood in the doorway of my home office and looked at it for a moment. Matte black, polished, positioned at the precise angle she always used. Handle turned outward for easy reach. A small domestic kindness that had once made me feel cared for. I left it where it was and went downstairs. The kitchen was quiet at that hour, the morning light coming in, flat and pale, through the east-facing windows. I used the shared espresso machine on the counter, the one we had bought together at a shop in Chapel Hill the previous winter, and made myself a single cup. No particular ceremony. Just ground, tamped, pulled. I carried it back upstairs, set it on my desk, and sat down. Then I reached over, lifted the thermal carafe, and carried it to the window planter, where Vanessa had placed a potted fig tree in the spring. I poured slowly, watching the dark liquid disappear into the soil. I rinsed the carafe in the small sink in the office bathroom, dried it, and set it back in its exact position on the desk. Handle turned outward. 20 minutes later, I heard her on the stairs. She appeared in the doorway in a light robe, hair still loose, a mug of her own cradled in both hands. Her eyes went immediately to the carafe, then to the cup beside my laptop. You already started without it, she said, a small note of surprise in her voice. I looked up from the screen and smiled. I picked up my cup and took a slow sip. Best coffee I've had in months, sweetheart, I said. I don't know what I was doing wrong before. She smiled back, warm, easy, entirely untroubled, and turned back toward the hallway. She had no way of knowing that every word of that was true. What followed was the longest performance of my life, and I had been performing in one form or another since I was 30 years old. I had delivered keynote addresses at 34 industry conferences over the course of my career. I had negotiated contracts across a table for men who wanted me to fail. I had sat in rooms where the outcome depended entirely on whether I could project a version of myself that was steady and certain when I was neither. I knew how to inhabit a role. I knew how to make a room believe what I needed it to believe. I applied every one of those skills to my own house. In video calls with partners and department heads, I began letting small errors show a name recalled a half-beat too late, a figure I had to check twice before confirming. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would raise alarm, just the quiet fraying of a man under pressure. I mentioned the stress of the transition. I laughed it off in the way people do when they want others to stop worrying, but actually want them to notice. I also installed a camera, a small unit not much larger than a thumb drive, tucked into the spine of a reference book on the third shelf of the living room bookcase, angled toward the sitting area where Vanessa took her afternoon calls. I had calibrated the lens the previous evening while she was on her run, confirmed the angle against the monitor in my office, and replaced the book without disturbing the shelf. On the third day, it gave me what I needed. I watched the footage that evening in the garage, seated in the dark, with the laptop balanced on my knees. Vanessa was on a video call, seated in the armchair by the window, her voice low and deliberate. The man on the other end of the call I recognized immediately, silver-haired, dark suit, the same window-surveying certainty I had first seen in footage from 4 years ago. Harlan Greer. He's declining faster than projected, Vanessa said. He forgot Mercer's name on a call yesterday. He had to check his own quarterly figures twice. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Good. I want this closed before the USPTO matter resolves. Come in person. Bring the documents directly. He paused. Make it social. Tell him I want to see the new house. Congratulate him on the contract. Keep it warm. He'll accept, Vanessa said. He will. Harlan agreed. Men like Raymond always do. They confuse familiarity with safety. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long moment. Nathaniel had predicted this, that Harlan would move to close in person once he believed the moment was right. He had structured the documents accordingly. The meeting would happen here, at Governor's Club on ground that was mine. Not in Charlotte, not on neutral territory. Here, 2 days later, Vanessa mentioned it over dinner, casual and warm. Her father wanted to come by. He had heard so much about the new house. He thought it would be nice to celebrate the federal contract in person. Of course, I said, cutting into my food without looking up. I've been looking forward to finally meeting Harlan Greer properly. She smiled. He'll be glad to hear that. I smiled back and said nothing else. That evening, I sat in the garage again to review the most recent footage. Harlan was on screen speaking to someone I couldn't see. By the time he understands what he's signed, it will already be too late. He said it the way someone might note a weather forecast, not cruel, simply certain. I reached over and closed the laptop. That, I said to no one, in the dark and quiet of my own garage, is exactly what I'm counting on. My phone buzzed against the workbench. Elliot. 3rd time in 4 days. I looked at the screen. I thought about the footage from one city center. I thought about 22 months of Roland Stanton watching and waiting, and about a man in room 412 who had kept every file and never stopped. I thought about what Nathaniel had said about timing, that in cases like this, the difference between winning and losing often came down to knowing which door to open and when. I picked up the phone. Elliot, I said. His voice was tight, careful, the voice of a man who had been rehearsing a conversation he wasn't sure he would get to have. Raymond, please. First Citizens Parking Lot, 6 Forks Road. 7 o'clock tonight. Come alone. A brief pause. I can explain everything. All of it. I checked my watch. I'll be there, I said. The First Citizens parking lot on 6 Forks Road was mostly empty at that hour. A few cars clustered near the ATM vestibule, their rooftops catching the amber glow of the streetlights. A fine mist had been falling since late afternoon. Not quite rain, the kind of weather that accumulates on your jacket before you realize it, and the asphalt reflected the lights in long, wavering strips. I pulled in near the far end of the lot and sat for a moment with the engine running. Elliot was already there. He was standing beside his car, a dark sedan I recognized from the Caldwell Dynamics parking garage, hands in the pockets of a gray jacket, collar turned up against the mist. He had always been lean, but he looked thinner than the last time I had seen him in person, which had been 2 weeks ago at a department review. His face, in the amber light, had the particular exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in a long time and had stopped expecting to. I turned off the engine and got out. He straightened when he saw me coming, but he didn't move toward me. He waited, the way people do when they are not sure of their welcome and have decided not to presume. I stopped a few feet away. "You have 5 minutes," I said. "Start talking." He nodded once, and then he told me. 8 months ago, Elliot had begun noticing anomalies in the access logs for Caldwell Dynamics internal data systems patterns that didn't correspond to any authorized workflow he could account for. Small transfers, irregular timestamps, credential use at hours that didn't match any scheduled task. He had compiled the data over 3 weeks before bringing it to Vanessa, which was the correct internal procedure. She had listened, thanked him, and told him she would look into it. Nothing happened. 2 weeks later, the anomalies continued. He went to her again. She told him the IT department had reviewed the logs and found nothing unusual. He knew that was not true, because he had spoken to IT himself, and they had no record of any such review. He contacted the FBI. "I didn't go to you directly," he said. "I want to be clear about why." He paused, choosing the words carefully. "Agent Halstead explained it to me in our first meeting. If you reacted, if you confronted Vanessa or changed your behavior in any visible way, Harlan Greer would know the operation was compromised. He would pull back. The money would move. The servers would go dark, and they would disappear before anyone could build a case." He looked at me steadily. Halstead needed Harlan to keep moving forward, to commit, to sign. That meant you had to remain in the dark. And you agreed to that, I said. "I didn't like it," he said. "I want you to know that. I didn't like a single day of it." He had spent the following months doing exactly what the FBI asked, maintaining his normal role at Caldwell Dynamics, observing, documenting, passing information to Halstead through a secure channel. When Halstead determined that a direct meeting with Harlan would yield critical evidence, Elliot had made the approach. He had presented himself as a mid-level executive with access and ambitions that had outgrown his current position, the kind of man Harlan's operation had used before. Harlan had taken the meeting. "He thought he was recruiting me," Elliot said. He spent 40 minutes explaining how a man in my position could significantly benefit from being on the right side of what he was building. He paused. I recorded every word. I thought about the footage from one city center, the handshake at the parking structure exit, the angle of the camera, the two figures moving through the lobby with the ease of familiarity. I had watched that clip a dozen times and read it as betrayal. "Every day I watched what was happening to you," Elliot said, and I couldn't say a word. Not one. His voice remained level, but something underneath it was not. "Do you have any idea what that feels like?" I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "What do you need from me?" He reached into his jacket pocket and held out his phone. I took it. The voice on the other end was measured, unhurried, and entirely clear. The voice of a man who had spent a career in situations where clarity was the only thing that mattered. "Mr. Caldwell, my name is Drummond Halstead. I'm a special agent with the FBI field office in Charlotte." A brief pause. "I think it's time the three of us sat down together. There are things you need to hear from me directly, and there are things we need from you to close this properly." "When?" I said. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Another pause and then, "Bring everything you have. Every file, every recording, every document. We need to make sure there is no exit from this for anyone involved." I handed the phone back to Elliot. He ended the call and slid it into his pocket. I looked at him, at the mist on his jacket, at the tiredness in his face, at the man who had answered a question correctly 8 years ago in a 40-minute interview, and had apparently been answering it correctly ever since in ways I had not been permitted to see. 8 months, I said. You carried that for 8 months. Elliot looked out across the wet asphalt toward the far end of the lot, where the street lights ran out and the road disappeared into the dark. He didn't answer. He just nodded, once slow, the kind of nod that doesn't accompany words, because words would diminish it. We stood there in the mist for another moment, two men in a parking lot in Raleigh, and said nothing else. Sometimes that is enough. The offices of Voss and Associates looked different at 6 in the morning. No receptionist at the front desk, no phones ringing, no ambient sound from the street below, which at this hour was as quiet as Fayetteville Street ever got. The overhead lights were set low, supplemented by the desk lamp Nathaniel had left burning when he arrived, which, judging by the 2 empty coffee cups near the credenza, had been some time before the rest of us. There were 4 of us around the long conference table, Nathaniel at the head, with his yellow legal pad and a folder thick enough to require its own rubber band. Roland's compiled files spread across one end in color-coded sections. Elliot to my left, still in the same jacket from last night. And across the table, a man I was meeting for the first time in person. Drummond Halstead was in his early 40s, medium build, with the kind of unremarkable face that was probably useful in his line of work. The sort of man you might pass in a hallway and not remember 5 minutes later. He wore a plain, dark suit, no tie, and set a government-issue recorder on the table without ceremony before sitting down. He had a stillness about him that was different from Nathaniel's stillness. Nathaniel organized, Halstead observed. "Let's begin," Nathaniel said. He opened the folder and removed a document 43 pages tabbed with a cover sheet that bore no title. He slid a copy to each of us. 25 years ago, Nathaniel said, when Raymond incorporated Caldwell Dynamics, he structured the company through a series of subsidiaries, 2 registered in Delaware, 1 in the Cayman Islands primarily for tax optimization purposes. This is a standard and entirely legal structure for technology companies with international revenue exposure. He paused. The consequence of that structure, however, is the accumulation of what tax attorneys call contingent liabilities. He let that phrase settle before continuing. A contingent liability is a financial obligation that exists on paper, but remains dormant until a specific triggering event occurs. In Caldwell Dynamics' case, the triggering event is a transfer of ownership of core intellectual property assets. The obligations were created legally documented properly and have simply never been activated because Raymond has never transferred ownership of anything. He turned to a tabbed section near the middle of the document. Appendix D, subsection 7.3. The language describes in technical terms drawn from international tax code an aggregate contingent obligation of $127 million that would transfer to any acquiring party simultaneously with the technology assets. I looked at the page. The language was dense, the kind of prose that required not just a lawyer, but a specialist in cross-border tax structure to fully parse. I had reviewed similar documents in other contexts over the years, and would not have caught it quickly under normal conditions. Harlan wants the technology, Nathaniel continued. The moment he takes ownership, those obligations follow. They are inseparable from the asset under the terms of the subsidiary structure. He looked around the table. He will be focused on the $340 million prize. His attorneys will review the contract, but the pressure from the USPTO timeline means no one will spend sufficient time on Appendix D. Halstead leaned forward slightly. I want to be precise about what we're doing here. His voice had the same quality as his face, unremarkable until you listened carefully. at which point it was very precise indeed. Every recording device at Governor's Club this Saturday operates under Federal Title III authorization, Halstead said. Raymond is not acting alone. He is a key participant in a controlled sting operation overseen by this office. That distinction matters enormously. He looked at me directly. Every word Harlan speaks in that room, every signature he places on that document, is admissible as evidence in federal court, immune to privacy challenges, immune to entrapment arguments because the authorization predates the operation. He paused. When Harlan signs knowing he is acquiring intellectual property obtained through corporate espionage, he confirms criminal intent on the record. The contract is not a trick, it is a confession. Nathaniel will be present as legal witness to the signing. Halstead continued. Everything that happens Saturday is documented, monitored, and clean. Elliot set a printed sheet on the table. There's one more item. He slid it toward the center. Theodore Wren and Marcus Hollis, 2 members of the Caldwell Dynamics Board of Directors, both have had undisclosed financial relationships with Greer Capital for approximately 14 months. He paused. They've scheduled an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. The agenda includes a no-confidence motion against Raymond. Halstead nodded. Federal court has granted a temporary injunction suspending their voting rights, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. It takes effect simultaneously with the arrest warrants on Saturday. I picked up the contract and turned to Appendix D. The language was precise, technical, and almost entirely impenetrable without context. $127 million buried in subsection 7.3 of a document that promised $340 million in return. I set it back down. It was the first time in 11 days that I had smiled, not from relief, not from satisfaction, but from the particular clarity that comes when a complicated thing finally resolves into a simple shape. Is there anything that could make Harlan suspicious before Saturday? Halstead asked, looking at me. I thought about it for a moment. One thing, I said. There's something I need to handle before then. On my own. Halstead held my gaze for a moment, then gave a single small nod. He was experienced enough to know when a question would cost more than the answer was worth. It was Friday morning, and I was reading through the contract for the 4th time when I heard the knock. Not her usual knock. Vanessa had a particular way of announcing herself at the office door, 2 quick raps, the second slightly louder, the rhythm of someone who expects to be welcome. This was different. 3 slow taps, with a pause between each one, the sound of a hand that had been raised and lowered twice before finally making contact with the wood. I closed the folder. Come in. She opened the door and stepped inside. She was dressed simply dark slacks, a pale blouse, and she was not carrying anything. No coffee, no tablet, no folder with talking points. Just herself, and the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision they cannot unmake. She closed the door behind her. She sat down in the chair across from my desk, the same chair where I had sat across from Nathaniel, across from Roland, across from Halstead, and folded her hands in her lap. She did not look away from me. Whatever she had come to say, she had decided to say it directly. I need to tell you something, she said. Before tomorrow. I leaned back in my chair. Outside the window, the first light of the morning was still new, laying thin and clean across the garden. I said nothing. She began at the beginning. The assignment had been structured before they ever met. She had known Raymond's profile, his schedule, his professional history. She had known about the divorce, the decade alone, the way he had rebuilt everything through work. She had approached Tech Connect with a briefing document and a set of objectives. She had done what she was sent to do. But the first year she said and then stopped. Started again. You were not what I expected. You didn't perform the way men in your position usually do. You didn't talk to hear yourself. You listened, actually listened to people who had nothing to offer you. You stayed late to review junior staff proposals that you could have ignored without consequence. She looked at her hands. I found myself looking for reasons to be in the same room. That was not part of the plan. I watched her face. I had spent 11 days watching faces very carefully, and I knew the difference between constructed emotion and the real thing. What I was looking at was not constructed. That made it harder, not easier, harder. Steer, I didn't know about the scopolamine until 3 months ago, she said. I want you to understand that. When I found out what my father had been adding to your coffee, I told him I wanted it stopped completely. Her voice remained even, but her hands tightened in her lap. He said that if I stopped cooperating, he would make sure you found out everything not from me. Not in a way I could explain or give context to, but in the worst possible way. And he would do it before I had the chance to say a single word to you first. She looked up. So I reduced the dosage instead of stopping it. I told myself it was buying time, that I would find a way out. She paused. I know that isn't a defense. I know what I did and what I allowed to happen are not separate things. I was trapped between you and him, and I was not strong enough to choose completely. The morning light had moved across the floor while she spoke, reaching the edge of the desk between us. I looked at it for a moment. In my mind, I saw the footage from the camera in the living room. Vanessa at the credenza opening the safe, photographing documents with the focused calm of someone performing a task they had done before. That footage existed. The medical report existed. The 8 months of data transfers to a Cayman server existed. A single conversation in a home office on a Friday morning, however honest, did not erase any of it. But I also saw what was in front of me, a woman who was crying without trying to hide it, and without trying to use it, which is its own particular kind of truth. I stood and walked to the window. I believe you feel what you're saying, I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected, not soft, just measured. I genuinely do, but loving someone and allowing the harm to continue are not two separate things, Vanessa. You knew. Every morning you knew. And you stayed. She said nothing for a moment. Then, let me go to him. Before tomorrow. Let me try to stop this. I turned from the window and looked at her. There was no hatred in what I felt. I want to be clear about that even now. But there are doors that once they have been opened and walked through cannot be closed from the inside. Harlan is coming tomorrow, I said. My voice had returned to its ordinary register, the tone I used in board meetings and contract negotiations. In the 47 conversations it had taken to close a federal deal worth $47 million. I'd like you to be here when he arrives. Can you do that? She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, slow, deliberate, the nod of someone who understands that they are no longer the one making the decisions. Good. I moved to open the office door. Wear something nice. She walked past me into the hallway without speaking. I pulled the door closed and stood alone in the corridor. The house was quiet around me. The particular quiet of a Friday morning, ordinary and unremarkable. The kind of morning that would not distinguish itself in memory, except that it was the last one before everything changed. I looked down at my hands. They were completely still. I had not known until that moment how much that would tell me about where I stood. The Research Triangle Park parking lot was half empty at that hour of the afternoon. I had driven there without a specific destination. In mind, the kind of driving you do when you need movement more than direction. I had pulled in between two identical white sedans, cut the engine, and sat looking at the Caldwell Dynamics building through the windshield. 41,000 square feet of glass and steel that I had spent 25 years filling with people and purpose. From this distance in the flat December light, it looked very still. My phone rang before I had finished the thought. Halstead. Raymond. No preamble. He had never used preamble in any conversation I had observed. We have a development, not a problem, but you need to know. He explained it in 3 sentences, the way he explained most things. Theodore Wren and Marcus Hollis had filed a formal request for an emergency board meeting, scheduled for Monday morning at 9. The agenda item as submitted was a review of executive leadership performance. The language was careful corporate and entirely transparent in its intent to anyone who understood what they were looking at. If they succeed in replacing you before Saturday's signing, Halstead said, the authority to enter into any technology transfer agreement reverts to whoever holds the CEO position. The entire structure unravels. And the injunction, I said, in place. The suspension of their voting rights executes simultaneously with the arrest warrants Saturday evening after the signing is confirmed. Not before. A pause. Shikri, which means Saturday has to happen cleanly. No delays, no complications. Nothing that gives Harlan a reason to reschedule. I looked at the building. On the 4th floor, where the research division occupied the south wing, I could see the lights still on behind the tall windows. People working on a Friday afternoon because the work mattered to them. People who had no idea what was being decided about the company they had given years of their lives to. I had put Theodore Wren on the board 9 years ago because his background in structured finance was exactly what a technology company scaling toward government contracts needed. Marcus Hollis had come 2 years later, a recommendation from a colleague I trusted with a track record in mergers that I had verified personally. I had chosen both of them because I believed that experience was the most reliable indicator of judgment. I was still learning what experience could be purchased for. I ended the call and dialed Nathaniel. He picked up on the first ring. There's going to be legal review on the other side, I said. Harlan is bringing his own attorney. Will the contract hold? There was a brief pause, not hesitation, just the pause of a man who is being precise rather than quick. Dear Raymond, Nathaniel said, I drafted that document. I have been working corporate fraud cases for 20 years, and I built that contract specifically to withstand scrutiny from a distance, up close, under time pressure, with a lawyer who has 48 hours of notice and a client who is fixated on a $340 million technology acquisition. Appendix D subsection 7.3 is invisible. Another pause. No attorney alive catches that clause on a first read under these conditions. I am certain of it. And if they ask for more time, I said. Then we give them the weekend, Nathaniel said evenly. And Halstead accelerates the warrant timeline. Either way, this ends Saturday. I sat with that for a moment. Through the windshield, The Caldwell Dynamics building held its familiar shape against the December sky. 25 years of decisions, of hires and contracts, and late nights and early mornings compressed into a structure of glass that looked from the outside exactly as it always had. This ends Saturday, Nathaniel, my consume. I said, one way or another. It ends Saturday, he said. And it ends your way. I set the phone on the seat beside me and looked at the building for another long moment. Then my phone buzzed. Not a call this time, but a notification from the encrypted messaging application Elliot used for secure communication. I opened it. The message was short. Harlan confirmed for Saturday. He is bringing his personal attorney and a notary public. He wants nothing left to procedural challenge. A line break. Raymond, he is also bringing a secondary document. A pre-signed consent form for voluntary technology licensing. He intends to present it alongside the main contract as a goodwill gesture. Another line break. He doesn't want to risk anything. I read it twice. A notary public. A secondary consent form. Harlan was walking into my house on Saturday with every procedural safeguard he could carry, convinced that he had anticipated every variable. The notarized signature would make the contract harder to dispute on technical grounds, which meant it would also make it harder for him to dispute later. When the contingent liability activated and the federal charges landed simultaneously, he was not being careful. He was being thorough in exactly the wrong direction. I typed back one line. Neither do I. I set the phone down and looked at the building one last time at the lit windows on the 4th floor, at the name on the entrance panel that I could not read from this distance but knew by heart. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow it would be over one way or another. But Nathaniel was right about one thing. I was on my 3rd pass through the contract when the phone rang. Unknown number, Burlington area code. I picked up. Mr. Caldwell. The voice was familiar, the same measured cadence I had heard 11 days ago when this all began, but something underneath it had changed. There was a tightness in it now. The particular compression of a man who is keeping his voice steady through deliberate effort. I'm sorry to call so late. I didn't know who else to contact. Darnell, I said. Tell me what happened. He told it plainly, the way he had told everything plainly since the beginning. The previous evening after closing time, 2 men had come to Triangle Tech Repair on Chapel Hill Road. He had not been there. He had stepped out for dinner, but the security footage from the neighboring dry cleaner caught them entering through the rear access door. They had gone directly to the storage room at the back of the building. What they left behind was a fire that consumed 3 shelving units of equipment and the better part of the rear wall before the sprinkler system engaged. On the floor near the door, they had left a note, handwritten, unaddressed. Forget what you found. Next time it's the whole building. Are you and your family safe? I said. We're at my sister's place in Mabane, he said. We've been here since this morning. I stood up from the desk and walked to the window. The Governor's Club grounds were dark and still lit only by the low landscaping lights along the path to the garden. Somewhere in that stillness, a man I had spent 11 days preparing to face was spending his last night thinking he had won. Darnell, I said, I need you to listen to me carefully. You did the right thing in every single step of this. Do you understand that? A pause. Yes, sir. I want you to stay in Mabane until Sunday. Don't go back to the shop. Don't speak to anyone about this other than the FBI contact you already have. I paused. You do have a FBI contact. Yes, sir, he said, and then added with the measured calm of a man who had thought several steps ahead from the very beginning. 3 days after I called you, I made copies of everything on that drive, every file. I put them on 2 separate USB drives and mailed one to the FBI field office in Charlotte with a written statement. I kept the other one. A brief pause. I figured this wasn't going to be simple. I'm not naive about what I got myself into. I stood at the window for a moment without speaking. 11 days ago, a man I had never met had called me from a repair shop in Burlington because his conscience told him to. He had not asked for anything. He had not leveraged what he knew. He had simply made the call, and then 3 days later had quietly ensured that the evidence could not be destroyed or denied. Not because someone told him to, but because he had thought it through on his own. I'll explain everything on Sunday, I said. Until then, stay where you are. You have my number. I ended the call and immediately dialed Halstead. He answered in one ring. I described what Darnell had told me, the arson, the note, the timing. Halstead listened without interrupting. Witness intimidation and destruction of property are federal charges when they're connected to an active federal investigation, he said when I finished. This adds 2 more counts to the existing indictment package. Greer is becoming nervous. Nervous enough to make mistakes, I said. That's usually how it goes, Halstead said. I'll have agents at the sister's address in Mebane within the hour, for verification and protection. I ended the call. I sat back down at the desk, opened my laptop, and navigated to the private banking portal. The transfer took less than 4 minutes to arrange. I created a dedicated reference for it, Triangle Tech Repair Rebuilding Fund, and set the amount, and confirmed. I did not think about it extensively. Some decisions are not calculations. Some decisions are simply what you do when you understand that a person who had no obligation to help you did so anyway and paid a price for it that they should never have had to pay. I would explain it to Darnell on Sunday. He would protest. I would not argue. I closed the laptop and went downstairs to the kitchen. The house was quiet. The dense quiet of a large space late at night, when the sounds of living have subsided, and what remains is just the building settling into itself. I made coffee from the machine on the counter, measured simple, nothing particular about it, except that I had made it myself. I carried the cup to the armchair in the living room and sat. The room was dark, except for the small lamp on the side table. I did not turn on anything else. I drank the coffee slowly, and thought about Darnell Booker, who had mailed a USB drive to the FBI because it was the right thing to do, and had not told anyone about it. I thought about Elliot Marsh, who had spent 8 months watching from the inside and saying nothing because the law required it. I thought about Archibald Winthrop, who had made the wrong choice for the right reasons and had carried it for 2 years. I thought about the kind of choices that look simple from the outside. I set the cup down on the side table and looked at the clock above the mantel. 10 hours. In 10 hours, Harlan Greer would walk through the front door of this house carrying everything he needed to take what he had spent 4 years building toward. He would bring a lawyer. He would bring a notary. He would bring the absolute certainty of a man who had done this before and had never lost. I turned off the lamp and carried the cup back to the kitchen. In the hallway, I paused outside the bedroom door. The room beyond was silent. Vanessa was either asleep or she was not. I found standing there in the dark corridor that I genuinely could not tell anymore, and that for the first time, it did not change anything about what I was going to do in the morning. I walked past the door and up to the office. I sat down at the desk. I did not turn on any additional lights. I sat in the quiet of my own house on the night before the last day of something I had spent 25 years building and 11 days fighting to keep. And I was, for the first time since the phone rang in Burlington, completely still. Not because there was nothing left to fear, because I was ready. Before I tell you exactly what happened, the morning Harlan Greer walked through my front door, confident, prepared, and completely certain he had already won. Leave the word "ready" in the comments to let me know you made it this far. This is the moment the entire story has been building toward. And I promise you, it ends exactly the way it needed to. Please note, this story contains fictional elements woven in for narrative and educational purposes. The details may not reflect any specific events, but the truth inside the story is something I believe is worth your time. If you would rather not continue, now is a good place to stop. I was dressed by 7, dark gray suit, no tie, the particular combination I had worn to every significant negotiation of my career, not out of superstition, but because it was the version of myself I knew most clearly. No watch, no cologne. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at the man looking back at me. 58 years old, salt and pepper hair that had gone fully silver at the temples sometime in the last year without my particularly noticing. The lines around my eyes that come from decades of squinting at spreadsheets and legal filings, and the faces of people across negotiating tables. I nodded at him once. 25 years ago, in a rented garage on Pettigrew Street in Durham, I had signed the first contract in Caldwell Dynamics history on a folding table with a pen borrowed from one of our 2 engineers. My hand had been unsteady, not from fear exactly, but from the specific physical sensation of understanding that the next signature would change the direction of my life. I had noticed it then. I had thought about it sometime since. This morning my hands were entirely still. Harlan Greer arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. A black sedan pulled through the gate and parked on the curved drive in front of the main entrance. 3 doors opened. Harlan emerged first, silver-haired, dark overcoat, moving with the deliberate ease of a man who has spent decades ensuring that every room he enters understands he has arrived. Behind him came a man in his mid-40s carrying a slim leather portfolio. The lawyer and a second man with a notary stamp case and a small camera for document recording. Vanessa met them at the door. I heard her voice in the entryway, warm and practiced, offering coffee, commenting on the drive from Charlotte. Her smile, when she brought them through to the living room, was calibrated to precisely the right warmth. If it was slightly tighter around the edges than her usual expression, only someone who had studied her face as long as I had would notice. I was standing in the center of the living room when they came in. Harlan. I stepped forward and extended my hand. I've heard a great deal about you. He shook it firm, measured a handshake designed to communicate authority without aggression. He looked at me with the particular attention of someone taking an inventory. I watched his expression settle into a quiet satisfaction. I recognized what it meant. I had spent a week giving Vanessa exactly the performance she had been reporting to him. Raymond, congratulations on the new house and the federal contract. Impressive work. His voice had the warmth of a man who is comfortable being generous when the situation requires it. I'm glad we could finally sit down. Nathaniel Voss. Nathaniel said, rising from the chair near the window and offering his hand to both Harlan and his attorney. Independent legal counsel. I'll be facilitating the documentation today on behalf of both parties. Harlan's attorney, a compact man named Forsyth, according to the card he placed on the table, asked to see the contract immediately. Nathaniel provided it without hesitation, and in the same motion, mentioned with calibrated casualness that the USPTO window on Project Meridian would close within 48 hours. A once-in-a-generation opportunity, he called it. The phrase landed exactly where Nathaniel had intended it to. Forsyth read, standing up, moving through the pages with the efficiency of a man whose client had already decided. Nathaniel answered each question. He raised the technology transfer definitions in Section 3, the representation and warranty clauses in Section 6, the payment structure in Section 8. Forsyth did not linger on the appendices. He reached page 31, paused at a clause regarding international regulatory compliance had it clarified, and closed the document. Harlan had spent 4 years believing he was dealing with a man whose mind was being quietly dissolved by scopolamine, a broken, increasingly unreliable executive who could be guided toward any signature without suspicion. That certainty was the reason he pressured Forsyth to move. That certainty was the reason no one looked at Appendix D. 14 minutes and 40 seconds. I had counted, throughout. I asked 2 questions, one about the payment schedule, which I got slightly wrong, and then corrected with a small, self-deprecating laugh. One about a term in Section 4 that I framed with the careful uncertainty of a man who had been reviewing documents he wasn't fully tracking. Harlan answered the second one with the patient precision of someone explaining something straightforward to someone who needs it explained. His tone was kind in the way that conceals condescension. He was very comfortable. Forsyth nodded at Harlan. Harlan uncapped his pen. He signed in 3 places. The notary followed protocol, verified identification, applied the seal to each page, activated the document camera. Nathaniel countersigned as witness. The entire process took 4 minutes. I stood up. The shift was not theatrical. It was not sudden. It was simply complete. The way a switch moves from one position to another. The same hand, the same room, an entirely different current. "Thank you, Harlan," I said. "Very efficient." I reached across the table and drew the contract toward me. I turned to the rear section and laid it flat. And I'd like to draw your attention to Appendix D, specifically subsection 7.3. I think your attorney may have moved past it under time pressure. Forsyth leaned forward first. I watched his eyes track down the page. I watched him stop. Harlan took the contract from him and began reading. The room was very quiet. Through the living room window, the Governor's Club grounds were still and golden in the late morning light. The color change in Harlan's face was gradual, and then not gradual at all. "This is a contingent liability transfer clause," Forsyth said. His voice had gone flat. "It is," I said. "By executing this agreement, Mr. Greer has accepted transfer of $127 million in structured liabilities arising from Caldwell Dynamics' subsidiary architecture. The triggering event was the transfer of core intellectual property which just occurred." I looked at Harlan directly. "Congratulations. All of it is legally yours now." Harlan stood. The chair moved back sharply against the hardwood floor. "This is entrapment," he said. The warmth was entirely gone from his voice. I looked at him without raising mine. "You came into my house to acquire technology worth $340 million that you spent 4 years engineering a theft to obtain. The plan to steal it, that was yours, Harlan. All I did was give you the opportunity to commit to it in writing." I paused. "I believe the term you're looking for is consequence." He reached for his phone. The door to the living room opened. Drummond Halstead stepped through first plain, dark suit government issue credentials already in hand. Behind him came three agents positioned without urgency, with the particular calm of people who have done this many times and see no reason to make it more dramatic than it needs to be. "Mr. Greer," Halstead said, in the same unhurried voice he used for everything, "please put the phone down. You're under arrest." Halstead set the arrest warrant on the coffee table with the same unhurried precision he applied to everything. "Harlan Greer." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You are under arrest for economic espionage under the Defend Trade Secrets Act wire fraud conspiracy to steal trade secrets, and as of last night, arson and witness tampering." He paused for exactly 1 second. "You have the right to remain silent." Harlan stood very still. I had watched men absorb bad news across negotiating tables for 25 years. There is a moment, it lasts less than 2 seconds, when the information reaches the face before the face has decided what to do with it. In that window, you see the actual person rather than the constructed one. What I saw in Harlan Greer's face in that 2-second window was not fear. It was the specific, cold recalculation of a man who has lost a position and is already looking for the next move. He was still looking for the next move when the agent behind Halstead stepped forward with the restraints. Forsyth, his attorney, was on his feet immediately. "I need to see the full warrant. I need to see every piece of documentation." Halstead produced a folder from the case he had carried in. It was thick. He set it on the table in front of Forsyth without a word. A second agent spoke briefly into a radio. Halstead glanced at me. "Oh, Vanessa is being processed at the security checkpoint now," he said quietly. She did not resist. I nodded. I looked out through the living room window at the garden. The copper watering can she had left near the flower bed along the south wall was still there, exactly where it had been the first afternoon, the afternoon of Darnell's call, when I had stood at this window and watched her move through the garden without knowing anything was wrong. The garden looked the same. Everything else was different. Elliot came in from the hallway, moving with the particular quiet of someone who has been waiting for a long time for a room to become navigable. USPTO confirmed receipt of Roland's submission at 9:02 this morning, he said. The patent application has been suspended pending fraud investigation. He paused. Theodore Wren and Marcus Hollis have been formally suspended from the board of directors as of 8:55. Monday's meeting has been canceled. I thought about the lit windows on the 4th floor of Caldwell Dynamics, the people who had come in on a Friday afternoon because the work mattered. I thought about what it would mean for them to learn in the days ahead what had nearly happened. Harlan looked at me from across the room. The recalculation was complete. His expression had settled into the practiced composure of a man who has expensive legal representation and intends to use it. "Chuck, you think this is over," he said. "I have attorneys in 4 states. 4 years ago, in an empty office in Durham that he had wired before Raymond Caldwell ever signed the lease, Harlan Greer had said that Raymond would never see this coming. He had been right about one thing. I had not seen it coming, not at the beginning, not from the direction it came, but I had seen it in time. And in the end, that was the only variable that had mattered. You also have $127 million in contingent liability with your notarized signature on the transfer document," I said. "Have a good day, Harlan." He had nothing to say to that. Halstead shook my hand before he followed his agents out. "It's over, Mr. Caldwell." I shook my head slightly. Not quite. One more thing. He looked at me for a moment. The fund. I nodded. He nodded back, and then he was gone. Nathaniel remained. He stood near the window after the room had emptied, after the agents, after Forsyth, after the sound of car doors closing on the drive outside had faded, and looked at me the way a person looks at someone they have known through a long and difficult thing. Vanessa was brought through the front entrance a few minutes later, hands secured at her wrists, flanked by two agents. She was dressed in the clothes she had put on for the morning, the ones she had chosen, because I had told her to wear something nice. She looked across the entryway as she passed the door to the living room. She looked at me. I looked at her. Neither of us said anything. There are things that break in ways that don't need words placed over them. The words would not have added anything. The silence was more complete. Nathaniel put his hand on my shoulder after she had gone. 25 years of work, he said, still standing. I did not answer immediately. I went to my desk. I opened the top drawer, the one I had opened a dozen times over the last month without thinking, as a habit that had formed around something I had intended to do. Inside the velvet box was where I had left it. I took it out and set it on the desk surface. I opened it. The ring caught the morning light through the window, platinum band, single stone, clean lines. I had chosen it because it looked honest. I looked at it for a long time. Then I closed the box and placed it on the desk in front of me. Not in the drawer, not across the room, on the desk, where it was visible. Some things do not require a dramatic ending. Some things simply reach the point where they have served their purpose, and you set them down, and you do not need to do anything more with them than that. I sat down. I opened my laptop. I created a new document. In the title field, I typed Caldwell Foundation for Technology Integrity. The room around me was quiet, in a way it had not been for a very long time. Not the pressed silence of something being concealed, but the open quiet of a space that had been cleared. I began to type. The words came more easily than I expected. I called Archibald at 7 on Sunday morning. The phone rang 3 times before he answered, his voice rough in a way that told me he either hadn't slept or had just forced himself awake. I didn't ask which. I said, Fearington House, 9 o'clock. There was a long pause before he said, I'll be there. The drive from Chapel Hill to Pittsburgh takes about 20 minutes on a quiet Sunday. I kept the radio off. The fields along US 15501 were pale gold in the early light, the kind of color that makes the whole state feel temporary, like a photograph before it fades. I had driven this road before a few weeks ago, when I was still trying to understand what had been done to me. This time I understood everything. The difference in how the steering wheel felt in my hands was hard to explain, but it was there. Archibald was already at the corner table when I arrived. He was 62 years old and looked every year of it that morning. His sport coat was pressed, but his hands gave him away, one resting flat on the table, the other wrapped around a water glass, as if he needed something to hold. He stood when he saw me. I crossed the room, sat down across from him, and for a moment neither of us spoke. It's done, I said. He exhaled slowly. I heard. Halstead's people called Renata's office last night to confirm she was not a target. He paused. She wasn't involved, Raymond. I need you to know that. I know, I said. I always knew. That seemed to take something out of him. His shoulders dropped. He looked at the table and said quietly, I will have to carry what I did for the rest of my life. It was the same line he had used weeks ago at this same table, but this time it sounded different. Less like a justification and more like a sentence he had finally accepted. I reached across and put my hand over his. He was 62 years old and one of the steadiest men I had known for 25 years, and his hand was trembling. I kept mine there until it stopped. "I'm not here to forgive you," I said. "I'm here because the silence needed to end. There's a difference." He nodded once slowly, and I saw his eyes go wet. He didn't let it become more than that. Neither did I. We stayed for 40 minutes. We talked about the early days in Durham, about a garage on Pettigrew Street that neither of us had thought about in years, about what it had felt like to build something from nothing, with no safety net and no guarantee. By the time I left, nothing between us was fully repaired. But the silence was gone, and that was enough for now. I drove north after lunch, up I-40 toward Burlington. The police tape was still across the front entrance of Triangle Tech Repair on Chapel Hill Road, yellow and slack in the afternoon wind. Darnell was inside. I could see him through the glass, moving slowly, sweeping ash from the back corner of the room with the focused calm of a man who had decided not to be beaten by what happened to him. I knocked on the frame of the open side door. He looked up, broom in hand, and nodded like he had been expecting me. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I know." I set an envelope on the cleanest section of the counter. "The transfer went through Friday. This is the rest in cash until the account clears." He looked at the envelope but didn't pick it up. "Raymond." "It's worth it," I said. "Every dollar. You didn't have to make that call. You didn't have to back up those files. You did it anyway." He picked up the envelope, then held it for a moment and said, "I just didn't think it was right to stay quiet." "No," I said. "It isn't." Halstead called while I was crossing back over the Haw River. His voice had the same flat, precise tone it always did, but there was something underneath it that sounded almost like relief. "We finished the preliminary review of Greer Capital's full operating history," he said. "We found matching patterns in 3 other cases: a data analytics firm in Austin, Texas, a systems engineering company in Richmond, Virginia, a software developer in Portland, Oregon. All 3 went under within 18 months of Greer Capital involvement. 11 individuals lost their businesses or livelihoods across those cases. The span runs about 10 years. I watched the river pass below me, brown and wide and indifferent. "Make sure they all know the truth," I said. "Every one of them." "We will," Halstead said. "That's a promise." I got back to Governor's Club just before 6. The house was quiet in the way that large houses become quiet when the people who filled them are gone. I didn't check the rooms. I didn't stand in doorways. I walked straight to my office, sat down, and opened my laptop. The document was still there from the night before, the cursor blinking at the end of the last line. I had typed, "Caldwell Foundation for Technology Integrity Mission Statement." I read it through once. Then I put my hands on the keyboard and smiled. Not because everything was fixed, not because the loss had disappeared, but because for the first time in 4 years, every word on the screen was entirely my own. I kept writing. 3 months is not a long time. It is long enough, however, to learn how to sleep through the night again. I was standing in the wings of a small outdoor stage erected in front of the Caldwell Dynamics building at Research Triangle Park when I first understood that. The December sky over Durham was the particular shade of blue that only appears in North Carolina in winter, clear and sharp, and so deeply itself that it almost looked painted. The air carried just enough cold to make you aware of your own breathing. A white banner with blue lettering hung above the stage Caldwell Foundation for Technology Integrity launch event. I had been watching the crowd fill in for about 10 minutes. Folding chairs on a concrete plaza, maybe 80 people. The kind of gathering that doesn't feel large until you recognize every third face. Archibald sat in the front row, his sport coat pressed, his hands folded in his lap. He had lost some weight since Fearington House. He looked steadier for it. Darnell sat one seat to his right, a paper cup in his hand, watching the banner with an expression I recognized as the look of a man still getting used to the idea that things had worked out. Elliot stood near the back, close to the building entrance, arms crossed, doing what he had always done, observing everything and saying nothing until he had something worth saying. And scattered through the middle rows, 11 people I had come to know over the past 8 weeks. A software developer from Portland, 2 engineers from Richmond, a founder from Austin who had driven 16 hours rather than fly because he told me he wanted to feel the distance closing. All of them had lost something to the same machine that had come for me. All of them had come to Durham on a Friday morning in December because someone had finally told them the truth. I thought of the footage from 4 years ago. Harlan's voice calm and precise. He's smart, but lonely. Lonely men trust absolutely. That's a door for us. I looked at the front row. I looked at the back. I looked at the 11 faces in the middle. I was not lonely, and I still trusted. I had simply learned at a cost I would not recommend to anyone exactly who deserved it. I walked out without notes. No teleprompter, no index cards, nothing in my hands. 25 years of keynote addresses at industry conferences had taught me that the only speeches worth giving are the ones you have already lived. I stood at the microphone and let the applause settle. Like I spent 25 years building something I believed in, I said. And then I spent 3 months learning that the most important thing I ever built was not the technology. It was knowing who to trust. And knowing that trust once broken can still leave room for something new. I did not name names. I did not recount the sequence of events. The people who needed to know the details already knew them. Everyone else needed only to understand what the foundation existed to do. I announced the fund, $89 million drawn from the federal settlement with Greer Capital, directed entirely into free legal support for startups targeted by economic espionage, independent security audits at cost, and a formal partnership with the FBI's Intellectual Property Unit and the USPTO's Fraud Division. I said that no founder should have to fight that kind of war alone and without a map. I said we intended to be the map. Then I turned slightly toward the back of the crowd. Caldwell Dynamics needs a CEO, I said. Not an advisor, not a caretaker. Someone who will run it with the clarity and integrity that this company was built on and that it came close to losing. I paused. Elliot Marsh has worked alongside me for 8 years. He has earned this more than once and in more than one way. I am stepping into an advisory role effective today because the best thing I can do for this company right now is trust the next generation to lead it. Elliot came forward from the back of the crowd. He climbed the 3 steps to the stage, shook my hand once firm the way he had always done everything, and faced the audience. The applause that followed was not polite. It was genuine, and it lasted longer than either of us expected. After the crowd thinned and the chairs were being stacked, I sat down on the front steps of the building. The plaza was nearly empty. The banner was still up, The December sun was low and direct and warm in the way that winter sun in the south sometimes is not enough to fool you into thinking it's summer, but enough to make you glad you're outside. I had brought a cup of coffee from the machine in the lobby. I had brewed it myself, carried it out myself, and now I held it in both hands, the way you hold something hot when the air around you is cold. I took a sip. It was simple coffee from a standard office machine. No particular roast, no careful preparation, nothing special about it at all. It tasted like exactly what it was. I looked out at the Research Triangle Park roads I had driven thousands of times across 25 years. I looked at the sky. I thought about the first cup of coffee in this story, the one that had arrived in Vanessa's hands warm and easy in a home office where I believed I had finally gotten everything right. I did not think about Harlan. I did not think about Vanessa. I did not think about the footage or the patent or the arrest or the ring still sitting in a desk drawer at Governor's Club. I sat in the winter sun in Durham, North Carolina in December 2025, and I breathed. That was all. That was enough. I stood, brushed off my slacks, and walked back through the glass doors. They closed behind me with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Outside, the North Carolina sky stayed exactly as blue as it had been all morning. If there is one thing this dad revenge taught me, it is that the most dangerous trap is not the one your enemy builds. It is the silence you choose to live inside because you are afraid of what the truth will cost you. I am not a man given to public confession, but I will say this once plainly. I believe God does not waste suffering. Every morning, I poured that coffee into the soil instead of into myself. Something in me was being quietly rebuilt. I did not understand it then. I understand it now. This has been my family story, not the version I would have chosen to tell, but the only one I have. And if you take nothing else from it, take this. Do not wait for a phone call from a stranger in Burlington to tell you something is wrong in your own house. Trust your instincts earlier than I did. Verify what you love, not because love is unworthy of trust, but because real love can withstand the light. My personal view, loyalty without honesty is just a longer way of being alone. And revenge, when it is clean and legal and documented in triplicate, is called justice. This family story ends where all honest dad revenge stories should not in bitterness, but in a December sky over Durham and a cup of coffee you made yourself. If this family story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Your support means more than you know. Thank you for staying until the very last word.